In this video we'll be discussing the Wood-Milne British Goodrich single stage foot pump, which we see here. Wood-Milne were established in 1896 in Leyland near Preston, Lancashire, and they initially were in business manufacturing a variety of rubber goods including rubber tyres and golf balls. But in 1911 they patented this rather good looking single stage foot pump. The pump is characterised by having a nice nameplate at the back which gives all the worldwide patents they took out on this pump, but the British patent was in 1911. They continued making this Wood-Milne pump until 1924, when the company was taken over by the British subsidiary of the American B.F. Goodrich company. They called themselves British Goodrich Rubber, and they continued making essentially the same pump from 1924 for around 10 more years. So here's an example of the British Goodrich pump, which we see is essentially the same but with different branding on the base there, British Goodrich, and a slightly different foot pedal, different shape, with the British Goodrich name on the foot pedal. And they also took the opportunity of removing the patent plate at the back, so that's not present on the later British Goodrich pump. This one has lost its dial gauge at the front and has been replaced by a pressure test valve, but essentially the same pump was produced but under different branding. There are one or two interesting examples around from the period when one company took over another. This is a British Goodrich pump, as it says on the base, but with a Wood-Milne foot pump brand on the foot pedal. So essentially a mixture, and they had kept at this stage the patent at the back. So here we have an example of the company in transition, using up some old Wood-Milne stock but starting their rebranding exercise with putting British Goodrich on the base of the pump. This one also has a gauge with British Goodrich on it, whereas the earlier Wood-Milne had, of course, Wood-Milne on the pump. So there we have the progress of the British Goodrich Wood-Milne pump from the original Wood-Milne through the British Goodrich and some interesting hybrids. I don't know how many of these were made. The production of these pumps went on for a long time, and for example the Wood-Milne here has the number 76566 stamped on the base, which could mean 76,000 were produced, but we're not sure. In 1934 the company decided again to rebrand itself and called itself at that point the British Tyre and Rubber Company. And at that point they started making monster pumps, exactly the same design and the same working principle, but we here have a very, very large British Tyre and Rubber Company pump, as you see BTR there, referencing the Wood-Milne patent, and everything else being essentially the same design but much bigger. So if we, in the rest of the video, examine the workings and the overhauling of this Wood-Milne pump, it'll be relevant for all the other pumps in the stable, so to speak. Dismantling the pump for servicing and overhaul is a very straightforward process, but a bit fiddly. First of all, you see the foot pedal arms and the external lever system for depressing the pump foot pedal and compressing air is very simply held together with cross axles, split pins and washers. This whole mechanism easily comes apart if one wants to replace the spring being a torsion spring with two arms, as you see here. If you need a spare torsion spring to repair your pump, I can supply these. The other area of the mechanism that often needs a little bit of attention, these trunnions at the base, which run along the side of the pump on the downstroke, usually need greasing and occasionally need a little bit of attention to make them run smoothly, but generally speaking they're okay. And the closing catch you see here, which actually engages with the top of the foot pedal to keep the pump closed, is also easily taken off and repaired if necessary, or replaced. We won't be taking this mechanism apart in this video because it's basically very straightforward and there's no need to. Additionally, the foot pedal unscrews from the top of the two foot pedal arms, and that is easy as well. So the first maintenance job one usually has to do is to replace the pump washer, and we'll be talking about that in the next video. The two bolts holding the crossbar here, which depress the the piston rod and compress the air inside the pump. We will be taking those apart and showing you how to replace the washer. The other area that we'll be talking about is at the front of the pump, the board-on tube pressure gauge and the air outlet, which, as we'll see later, has an inbuilt non-return valve, a ball bearing held in place behind a screwed bung with a soft spring. So those are the two areas we'll be talking about: replacing the piston washer and the front end of the pump, the gauge and the non-return valve. Here we show the piston and piston rod assembly after it's been removed from the back of the pump to allow the barrel to be cleaned out and for replacing the leather washer if necessary. The piston rod itself, with the piston and washer at the front end, is held on a spreader bar at the back, and the two actuating rods, which the foot pump mechanism actuates, they locate into holes in this spreader rod and are held in place with two nuts, washers and pins to go through the holes in the nuts to stop them unscrewing. So it's a relatively easy job to remove those split pins, nuts and washers, and withdraw the piston rod assembly from the back of the pump. The only thing one has to do is spring off this small brass piston backplate, and that allows the piston rod and piston to be withdrawn. The normal procedure for cleaning out the barrel and making sure there's no mineral oil and grease in it is necessary, but there are two important things to mention in relation to this pump and the piston. First of all, the diameter of the barrel is a bit unusual. It measures at 1.9 inches, whereas the majority of pumps of this size either had 2-inch or 2 1/8 inch diameter barrels. that means that it's an unusual size of washer that's needed on this, and unless one has a former of exactly the right diameter, one's forced to use the Jubilee clip method for making a washer, and that's indicated here, and it's described in detail in my book and on the website, where one uses the actual piston head as a former with the wetted leather crimped tightly around it with the Jubilee clip to let it dry. And after taking the Jubilee clip off, one can trim the washer and oil it and reinstall it. The piston head comes off easily with the nut there to put the new washer material on, and then the Jubilee clip goes on top. The second thing to mention is that the piston head is large compared with the size of the barrel, such that there's only a very thin aperture left for the washer to fit in. So I've found that by using 2.5 to 3 millimeter leather, which I do on most pumps, is too thick, and it prevents easy pumping. So it's a good idea, if renewing the washer in a Wood-Milne like this, to use thinner leather, and I'd recommend 2 millimeters or even 1.5 millimeters thickness leather. It's a little bit of a trial and error process, but try 2 millimeters, and that may well work in your case, depending on the nature of the leather, and if necessary you may need to go for thinner leather. If the leather is too thick, it creates a partial vacuum when pumping, and the return stroke of the pump is very slow and inefficient. So selection of the leather at 2 millimeters or even a touch thinner is necessary when renewing the washer on a Wood-Milne. Here we see the outlet of the pump dismantled. The first thing to note is that there is a non-return valve at the outlet at this aperture point here, consisting of a ball bearing 5 millimeters, 0.2 inches diameter, with a soft spring held in place with a screwed bung with a hole in the middle. This is the non-return valve, which prevents air going back into the pump from the tyre under pressure. It allows air out into the tyre but prevents it backflow back into the pump. As usual, if this ball bearing is pitted or damaged in any way, best to replace it. The spring is usually okay, but one can find small springs to replace that. And the screwed bung is usually okay to screw it in. But a thorough cleaning out of that aperture and making sure the ball bearing is clean as well, so it sits in the seating and gives a good seal, is the most important thing. At the top of the outlet one has another aperture, and this is where the board-on tube tyre gauge fits. Here we have it with Wood-Milne on top, and it's a back entry gauge, so you see a central screwed back entry position. What you'll note on this pressure gauge is that although it's off the pump, it's not indicating zero, and that is one of the characteristics of these gauges. They're only accurate often at 2 or sometimes 3 points on the scale, and in this particular case the internal mechanisms are such that it's not accurate at 0. One could adjust the internal mechanism to get it back to 0, but it would then not be accurate at other points on the scale, and one is never sure which points it's accurate on. The other point to note, of course, is a very, very tight gradations, both in newtons per metre squared and in pounds per square inch, very, very difficult to read from a standing upright position when the pump is on the floor. So at the very best, these board-on tubes will only indicate approximate pressure, and it's far better to check with a handheld gauge on the tyre itself. The thread size on the outlet aperture where the hose connects to the pump is a 1/8 BSPP, that's 1/8 British Standard Pipe thread, and hose tails with this thread fitting are very easy to obtain, not difficult at all. Finally, it's worth discussing in detail a couple of points in relation to overhauling and maintaining the pump at its outlet end. First of all, you'll notice here that the board-on tube pressure gauge is protected by a metal crossbar when the pump's in the closed position. This is to stop any damage because the gauge is a rather delicate piece of equipment. But if you look closer, you'll find that there's very little clearance between the top of the gauge and this crossbar, which does make finding a replacement difficult, because most modern back entry dial gauges like this one here are rather deep and won't fit under that space, allowing that crossbar to or preventing the crossbar fouling the gauge. So this is quite a difficult thing, and if one can't repair the gauge, there is great difficulty in finding a replacement gauge to fit. I have tried many times and not been able to find a suitable supplier of a shallow back entry gauge. So if the gauge is missing or is not working or leaking, one is faced with doing something a little bit more different to make the pump work. And what we see here on this British Goodrich pump is a little tank test valve, a pressure test valve, which one can obtain, which is simply screwed in to where the board-on tube gauge would have sat, and this allows pressure to be taken with a separate handheld gauge during pumping without disconnecting. So a suitable and useful alternative to the pressure dial gauge if one can't find a replacement or mend the original. This is a very simple system here. It's got a normal Schrader valve in it, which is the same as on a normal motor car, and a useful little screwed cap which helps it seal and prevents any dirt getting in. So those are a couple of things to bear in mind when overhauling the pump and having difficulty in either repairing or replacing the pressure dial gauge. I hope this video has given you some useful hints and tips about dismantling and overhauling a Wood-Milne or British Goodrich foot pump. They're an attractive pump, easily stowed, very effective, and relatively easy to overhaul and maintain. If one does have any problems with the dial gauge at the front, and this is a common issue, then a suitable alternative is to replace with the pressure test valve, as we see here, which will get you up and puffing again in no time. A beautiful looking pump with a fairly complicated mechanism there on the top, but this is a very attractive feature, and it's well worthwhile repairing and getting an old Wood-Milne or British Goodrich pump up and running.